The assembly will now come to order. The chief clerk will call the roll.
Assemblywoman Anderson. Assemblywoman Backus. Assemblywoman Bilbray Axelrod. Assemblywoman Brown May. Assemblyman Carter. Assemblywoman Cohen.
Here.
Assemblywoman Considine. Assemblyman DeLong. Assemblywoman Dickman. Assemblyman De Silva. Assemblywoman Duran. Assemblywoman Gallant. Assemblywoman Gonzalez. Assemblywoman Gorlow. Assemblyman Gray. Assemblyman Gurr. Assemblyman Hafen. Assemblywoman Hanson. Assemblywoman Hardy. Assemblyman Hibbets. Assemblywoman Howdigi. Assemblywoman Kasama. Assemblyman Koenig. Assemblywoman LaRue Hatch. Assemblywoman Marzola. Assemblyman MacArthur. Assemblywoman Brittany Miller. Assemblyman C.H. Miller. Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno. Assemblywoman Mosca. Assemblywoman Newby. Assemblyman Wynn. Assemblyman O'Neill. Assemblyman Orlicker. Assemblywoman Peters. Assemblywoman Summers Armstrong. Assemblywoman Taylor. Assemblywoman Thomas. Assemblywoman Torres. Assemblyman Watts. Assemblyman Urich. Assemblywoman Gonzalez. Assemblywoman Hanson. Assemblywoman Marzola. Assemblywoman Newby. Assemblywoman Peters. Speaker Yeager.
Here. Assemblywoman Howdigi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May the record reflect we have 37 members present, 5 absent, excused.
The record shall so reflect. We have 37 members present, 5 absent, excused. That means we do have a quorum. Would members, members of the assembly and guests please rise? We have the prayer this morning by one of our own, Assemblywoman Angie Taylor.
Good morning. Good morning. I grew up in the black church. We talk back to people, so. Good morning. It is my privilege to lead us in prayer, and I'm going to ask you to join me in whatever name you pray. Father God, in the name of Jesus, Lord, before we ask you for anything, we want to thank you for everything. We thank you, Lord, for getting us here safely, Lord. We thank you, Lord, for allowing us to serve in these distinguished positions, Lord. We thank you, Lord Jesus, for the honor and privilege of leading your people. We thank you, Lord, because we've been able to accomplish great things for the people of Nevada, those who you have entrusted us to lead. Father, we pray that you would allow us, you would give us strength, Lord Jesus, allow us to walk worthy of the vocation in which we are called, Lord. We ask you to help us to earn the right to lead, for it is a privilege. It is a privilege, Lord. It is not a right that's just given to us. Father, we ask you that while we go through the business that we have to do on today, and hopefully just today, Lord, we ask that you would strengthen us, Lord, to choose people over personality, Lord, to choose policy over politics, Lord, and to use wisdom as we make these decisions, Lord. Guide us, lead us, Lord, and allow us to go forward together, Lord, with discernment. And Father, we pray, Lord, that you remind us that we do not fight against flesh and blood, against each other, Lord, but against those who would divide us, who would want harm to be done in this body and to your people. Lord, and when it's all said and done, we want to glorify you. And Father, as I end this prayer, I ask you to get us out of here. In your name, amen.
Please remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Thank you.
Order Business 2, reading and approval of the journal.
Carson City, Monday,
Assemblywoman
June 12th.
Howdigi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move to dispense with reading and approval of the journal and allow the Speaker and Chief Clerk to make any necessary corrections and additions.
You've heard the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. Motion carries. Order Business 7, messages from the Senate.
Senate Chamber, Carson City. Senate Chamber, Carson City, June 7th, 2023. To the Honorable the Assembly, I have the honor to inform you that the Senate on this date adopted Assembly Concurrent Resolution Number 1. Sherry Rodriguez, Assistant Secretary of the Senate.
Order Business 8, motions, resolutions, and notices. Assemblywoman Howdigy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Under Order of Business 8, I move that persons as set forth on the Nevada Legislature's press accreditation list of June 13th, 2023 be accepted as accredited press representatives, that they be assigned space at the press table in the Assembly Chamber, that they be allowed the use of appropriate broadcasting facilities, and that the list be included in this day's journal.
You have heard the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. Motion carries. Assemblywoman Howdigy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Staying under Order of Business 8, I move that the Assembly resolve itself into a committee of the whole for the purpose of hearing an informational presentation on economic development and stadium infrastructure projects.
Assemblywoman Howdigy has moved that the Assembly resolve itself into a committee of the whole for the purpose of hearing an informational presentation on economic development and stadium infrastructure projects. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. The motion carries. The Assembly is resolved into a committee of the whole. Committee members, we are going to go into a recess. We are waiting on our presenters for this bill, who I believe are making a presentation to the Senate Committee of the Whole at the moment. So if you could stay close, and as soon as they are ready to come and present, we will come back to order and begin with the presentation. So until then, we will be in a brief recess for the Committee of the Whole. The Committee of the Whole will come back to order. I will note for the record that Assemblywoman Gonzalez is now present as well. Before we get started in the Committee of the Whole, I just wanted to go over some ground rules for how the hearing is going to work today. Our Assembly standing rules under Rule number 45 specify how Committee of the Whole is to be run, and I think most pertinent to this body is that each member of the Committee of the Whole is allowed to speak twice, meaning that you'll have a chance to ask 2 questions, but the rules do specify that every member must be given the opportunity to speak once before any member speaks twice. So we will have, after the presentation, we will have 2 rounds of questions. We'll make sure everybody who wants to ask a question has a chance to ask one, and then we'll come back for round 2. Obviously, you don't have to use one or both of your questions, but I would urge members of the body to think about those questions and also to listen to other questions that are asked, because I suspect with the number of us here, there'll be many duplicative questions. I want to ask, as always, even though we are on the Assembly floor, we are in committee, and would ask that members be respectful of one another and to our presenters. And then when we get to the testimony portion of the bill, which candidly is going to be later this afternoon, would of course just ask folks who are testifying to state and spell their name for the record. The testimony will be limited to 2 minutes per speaker. And as indicated on the agenda, testimony will be permitted in person here in Carson City and also at the Grant Sawyer Building in Las Vegas. There is a very likely scenario that we'll have to limit the amount of total testimony to be able to get through it. I don't know what limit that will be right now. We'll have to assess where we are in terms of question and the presentation. And then I wanted to note as well that for those who cannot be here in person to testify, we do have an option to send an email. And so on the agenda, there is an email address, and I will note that for the record as well. Anyone who wants to provide public comment, testimony in support, opposition, or neutral to this concept can send an email to the following email address. It is ASM, as in Mary, COW @asm.state.nv.us. If you send an email there, it will be made part of the official public record of today's hearing. It will go up on our Nellis electronic system, and you have 48 hours after we're done with the hearing to submit that comment in writing. So I believe that was a fair and equitable way to make sure that anybody who wants to weigh in has an opportunity to weigh in. And again, that information is available on the agenda. So the plan, just so committee members know, is we have our presenters here with us, and we're going to invite them down to the table in a moment to present the informational presentation on economic development and stadium infrastructure projects. After they're done presenting, we'll start questions. We are going to break at about 12:45, so we have about an hour and a half. That break will be for lunch, and for anyone who wishes to attend a bill signing that's happening at 1 o'clock over at the governor's office. And we'll plan to be back here at 1:30. So we're going to try to keep that to a real 45-minute break so we can get through all of this today. So with that, I think we are ready to begin our presentation. So I would invite Mr. Aguero and Mr. Hill down to the table here, and anyone else you might have with you at the moment, down to the table here in the Assembly chamber, and we'll give you an opportunity to make the presentation about the current status of this project and any amendments that have been discussed, and then we'll have an opportunity for some questions. So thank you, too, for being here. I know you've worked a lot of long hours over the last couple days, and that you came just from the Senate as well, so appreciate you being here, and whenever you're ready, please go ahead and start.
Chair Yeager, members of the committee, my name is Steve Hill. I am the CEO of the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority, as well as the chairman of the Las Vegas Stadium Authority. I want to thank you for your time today and your time over the past week. We are very excited about this project. We feel that it is another great opportunity for Las Vegas and for the state of Nevada to continue to drive the momentum in the tourism and hospitality industry, to complete our claim as the sports and entertainment capital of the world, and to really bring another spotlight to Las Vegas and help drive this industry forward. We are going to work hard to make sure that you feel, as you look back on your time here, that this has been time well spent. We very much appreciate all of the time, all of the input that all of you have provided to us over the past number of weeks. We feel that there are three really tangible benefits to this project and this bill. The first is that it is a jobs bill. It is going to create thousands of jobs for Las Vegans and Nevadans. They are great jobs. A vast majority of those will be covered by collective bargaining agreements. This is a jobs bill. This is also an exceptional investment for both the state and the county. For every tax dollar that is invested, and we are counting both the tax dollars that will be repaid as well as the tax dollars that won't in that statement, there will be 3 times as much tax revenue coming back to the state and local governments as will be invested. And the third really tangible benefit, and you'll hear more from this as we make our presentation, and we've worked closely with you during this process, you will have what is a national model for community benefit agreements. The A's have made significant commitments. The work that is in the law and is in the community benefit commitment that the A's have will be followed by many across the country. So we're excited about the opportunity to be here. I want to welcome Mr. Aguero. We also have Yolanda King, who has helped us with this community benefit process, and Catherine Aker, who will join us here from the A's. Presentation has 6 sections, and you will hear from all 4 of us throughout this presentation. The first is just a project overview. I think by now all of you know what the project is. It is a 9-acre site. That site is now designated in law, as well as committed by the A's and Bally's at the Tropicana site at the southeast corner of Tropicana and Las Vegas Boulevard. The stadium will be at least 30,000 seats, maybe a little bit more than that. It will be at least a $1.5 billion investment in total, not less than $1.1 billion of that by Mr. Fisher and the Fisher family and the A's. You know where the site is, and there are a couple of maps that exhibit that. There's a map on page 7 that shows the major sports complexes in that area: T-Mobile Arena, Allegiant Stadium, and the proposed A Stadium at the Tropicana site, which is a unique size. It is obviously more than 10,000 seats larger than T-Mobile Arena, certainly larger than that than the other arenas in the area, and then significantly less large, less in size than Allegiant Stadium at 62,000 seats. You see a couple of different renderings. This is going to be the greatest location for a baseball park in the United States. There's just no better place to both take in a game and have an experience around a game than at the intersection where this stadium will be. There's a project timeline on page 11. There are obviously many more topics that could be addressed on this timeline, work that will need to be done between these milestones. But if the legislation's approved here in '23, Major League Baseball will approve the move to Las Vegas for the A's this year as well, soon we think. Construction will begin toward the end of 2024. That has been delayed a little bit because of this site and the requirement that the current structure on that site will need to be demolished before construction of the stadium can start. Construction will be completed certainly by early 2028, and the stadium will be ready to host the A's for the 2028 season in the spring of that year. This will be, on page 12, you can see the smallest ballpark in Major League Baseball. That is a trend that is continuing in baseball, making stadiums smaller. The upper ring of a stadium is both the most expensive seats to build as well as the least occupied. The stadium is sized to the projected attendance at the games, which is in the 27,500 fans per game. So the stadium has been sized to balance with that. And that 27,500, as you'll hear a little later, is about the average of Major League Baseball attendance currently. I'll turn it over to Mr. Aguero for the funding structure.
Chair Yeager, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Jeremy Aguero. I'm going to walk through the funding structure with you. I also want to echo Mr. Hill's thanks for your patience, attention, and assistance. I'm going to be walking through the bill as amended, as that was the request. I can certainly highlight some of the amendments as we go, but the slides that have been provided to you reflect all of the amendments that are included in the current working draft of Senate Bill 1. Mr. Hill talked about what is on slide 14, which is the general breakout of the cost. Right now, the estimated cost of the project is about $1.5 billion, with the A's contributing $1.1 billion, which will be substantial, more than any private investment in a Major League Baseball ballpark in history, and then the state contributing up to $380 million. I think it's important to point out here that in the event that the project cost comes in over expectations, the state has exactly zero potential liability associated with that. The A's take 100% of the risk relative to the development of the project and the operations of the project overall. On the next slide, slide 15, you see the general overall structure, if you will, for the way the project is to be funded. At the top is exactly what Mr. Hill talked about before. In the second set of dark blue rectangles, you see the same thing I just talked about in terms of the allocations that get us to $1.5 billion. The light blue sections is where we get the elements that the public contribution is how it's made up. The first is the creation of a sports and entertainment improvement district. The second is the use of transferable tax credits. And the third is the Clark County Development Agreement credit. The first of those is the one that we've spent quite a bit of time talking about over the past few weeks, and that's the creation of a sports entertainment improvement district. Essentially, the county will issue general obligation bonds that will be supported by a set of revenues: sales tax, live entertainment tax, payroll taxes, commerce taxes, and there are about 17 taxes that are identified in the legislation as it's currently drafted. Some of them we don't have information or enough information about the project to be able to estimate how much those revenue yields will be, but the idea is whatever revenues are generated by the project will be reinvested in the project and will be utilized for the repayment of those general obligation bonds that will be issued by the county. You'll notice that underneath the first of those light blue boxes, there's a few gray boxes that are included in there. This is the security, or the additional security for those bonds that are issued. The first is a 2-year reserve. The first of those reserves is issued at the time the bonds are issued. So it's funded, I should say, at the time the bonds are issued at average annual debt service. So at the point at which the bonds are issued, there's a full year's worth of debt service that has to sit into a bank account. The second of those is paid out of the waterfall. We'll talk about the waterfall in a moment, but the additional revenue that is created by the project, some of that revenue will be utilized to fund a second year's reserve. So 2 full years, we expect by the end of the construction phase of the project, will be sitting in a bank account. The second of those dark gray areas is the concept of coverage. The Senate Bill 1, as amended, requires 2 times coverage, which means that for every $1 that is available for the payment or dedicated to the principal and interest payment on the bonds, a full another dollar has to be available toward the project. Half of that will come from cash coverage, that's shown there. The second half will come from the creation of a state backstop or a state line of credit, a credit enhancement that will be there. Therefore, there will be $1 available for every $1 that is required to make the scheduled principal and interest payments. Beyond that, we have transferable tax credits. The bill, as originally brought forward, contemplated $180 million of transferable tax credits, $90 million of which would be potentially refunded through the waterfall. That has been amended in the bill to be $180 million worth of transferable tax credits and $120 million that are potentially refundable. Finally, we have the Clark County Development Agreement credit that's shown on the far right-hand side. The project specifically requires that the A's work with the host jurisdiction, in this case the county, to make sure that there's sufficient revenue available for infrastructure, transportation, parking, utilities, the safe and efficient use of the airport. All have to be accounted for there. Those are going to come with costs that are not currently included in the $1.5 billion project estimate, and the county has agreed to provide a $25 million credit toward those costs overall. In addition to that, we talk about what happens in terms of, there's been a lot of conversation about this waterfall that exists. The waterfall, as amended, will be shown in a moment on slide 16 in the packets that have been provided to you. That waterfall has a number of steps to it. The first is obviously to pay the principal and interest on the bonds. The second is to fund the operations of the Stadium Authority up to $1 million per year. The third is to provide supplemental maintenance and operation costs in the event that the hopefully very unlikely event that the A's fail to meet their obligations. The Stadium Authority Board is allowed to use those revenues to operate the stadium or put it in a state where it could be sold or used otherwise. There's an allocation to the second year reserve that I mentioned earlier. There are repayments of any draws to the credit line that we talked about, the credit enhancement, or if any of the reserves are utilized. That is to say, if the credit reserve the credit enhancement is needed as additional revenue is generated by taxes, that has to be paid back through that waterfall. There's a $5 million capital reinvestment back into the project that's included, and then there is a split between the county and the state relative to funds that are used to repay the transferable tax credits or fund a homeless prevention and assistance fund through Clark County. For the first $45 million that are available for repayment, that split is 90-10, with 90% going to the state for the repayment of the transferable tax credits, and 10% allocated to the Homeless Prevention and Assistance Fund. Anything above $45 million to $120 million goes 80% to repay the transferable tax credits, and $5 million, and then the 20% to pay up to $5 million a year toward the Homeless Prevention and Assistance Fund. After that, there's a residual. Any money that falls all the way to the bottom of that ultimately is utilized for really 3 purposes. 1 is the early defeasance of the bonds. 2 is capital reinvestment back in the project. And number 3 is infrastructure in and around the project, is if it's needed. Again, the expectation here is that if the project overperforms, there should be additional funds utilized for the repayment of transferable tax credits or money flowing in, additional funds flowing in to the Homeless Assistance Fund overall. The next slide, slide 17, looks at the opposite scenario. What happens if revenues come in under expectations? The first is that the cash coverage that exists, you'll recall that we talked about 2 times coverage. Half of that 2 times coverage is additional estimated revenues from the taxes that are directed into the sports and entertainment district. That extra money is the first line of defense and will be utilized to pay the principal and interest on the bonds. If those dollars were insufficient, the next would be that the A's would tap the credit line that's provided by the state, the credit enhancement, up to 0.5 times of the amount of the principal and interest payments on the bonds. Assuming that was fully utilized, the first year reserve would be needed. Assuming that was fully utilized, the second year would be utilized. And if all of those reserves were utilized, what is essentially about 4 years worth of zero revenue being generated by the project, it would be the full faith and credit of the county that would be utilized to make sure that the bondholders were made whole. On slide 18 is a funding comparison that's been discussed somewhat, and I've alluded to this throughout my comments to you today, and that is on the far right-hand side is what the stadium that's before you looks like today relative to the deal structure. 25% public, 75% private funding, which is competitive, if not superior, to the vast majority of other stadiums, baseball stadiums that you see here. In addition to that, you'll notice that the $1.1 billion that's being put in by the A's substantially larger than almost frankly, every stadium that's shown on our schedule here. The next slide, slide 19, looks at a comparison between the size of the market and the share of public funding. And you'll notice that the A's stadium is in the bottom left-hand quadrant, but stadiums that are built in smaller markets, which are shown in the top left-hand quadrant of the schedule, have a tendency to get larger amounts of public funding. That is not the case here. In the case here, this is a smaller market, meaning there are fewer corporations to sell suites to, a smaller media market, and it is also proposed to receive, less public funding overall. The next slide is slide 20, which shows the Sports and Entertainment Improvement District. One of the elements that was amended into the bill in a couple of places essentially makes it clear that the Sports and Entertainment Improvement District and the stadium site itself, which largely overlap and in many cases will be the same thing, right, cannot include a hotel casino, a motel, or any type of accommodation, and it cannot include a licensed gaming establishment. What is shown here is the site where the Tropicana exists. Also in the amendment is the requirement that the project be constructed on this site, on the southeast corner of Tropicana Avenue and Las Vegas Boulevard in Clark County, Nevada. The project itself, as Mr. Hill alluded to, will require about 9 acres. The expectation is that the Tropicana will be demolished and that the balance of the site will at some point be redeveloped in some type of hospitality use. That said, what you see here is where the stadium will be and where the Sports and Entertainment District will largely be focused. This slide is 21. I will apologize in advance for the number of words on this slide. I tried to make it more brief in terms of its structure, but I thought that some of these points were really important in thinking about what the public's position is relative to the deal that's being provided to you today. The first of those is that the A's put the first money in and the public puts the last money in. The A's are required to dedicate the land on which the stadium will be constructed and put the first $100 million of the project in. They will have substantial equity invested in the project before the first public dollar makes it into the project. In addition to that, it is the last $50 million of the project that is funded by the public. If there are cost overruns, if the project is delayed for some reason, that is the sole responsibility of the A's, and they will have to make up that difference before any additional public money gets put into the project, and the project must be closed out before such time as the final $50 million is put into the project. The second of the elements that's included here is the non-relocation agreement. Right? What this essentially says is that the A's are required to enter into an agreement to not leave for 30 years. If they violate that agreement at any point in the next 30 years, they are required to pay off the bonds, and they are required to pay off any of the then outstanding refundable, transferable tax credits that exist. In which case, if that were to take place, the Stadium Authority Board in that case would own a stadium free and clear. The A's, I suppose, can leave, but their money will stay in the state of Nevada. In terms of the conservative bonding requirements, I think this is particularly important as we go through this. We have worked diligently with Clark County, and I want to express my thanks to Clark County and the staff in particular for going through this. They are tireless advocates for making sure that the structure of this deal is sound and is fiscally responsible. 2 times coverage, $2 allocated for every $1 that is available, 2 years worth of coverage. There's been a lot of conversation, I'm sure we'll talk about it more today, about some of the projections that underlie some of the estimates that are provided here, and I look forward to all of those questions. But I do want to make sure that something is clear. These are projections that were originally created by the A's based on their knowledge of the team and based on their conversations with other Major League Baseball stadiums. They then worked with a company called CSL. CSL, also sometimes referred to as Legends, is the foremost expert anywhere in the United States. As a matter of fact, I don't know anyone that's even their competitor relative to doing estimates and doing feasibility analyses for stadiums and arenas. They're the ones that prepared the projections. And as a matter of fact, the A's actually went through a process to essentially moderate or bring down some of those projections, including spending estimates. Those projections were then reviewed by our firm, Applied Analysis, and some adjustments were made. They were reviewed by Goldman Sachs. They were reviewed by Hobbs, Ong, and Associates. The Clark County then retained Public Financial Management, often referred to as PFM, to do another review of the document in which they reviewed all of the estimates that were ultimately provided by the model that we provided to them and determined that they were reasonable. I believe that is the case. I look forward to any further conversations, but certainly the county made sure that the exercise here went through everything in as detailed a way as possible. With that, I appreciate the opportunity to provide this testimony, and I'll turn it back over to Mr. Hill for governance and oversight.
Thank you, Jeremy. As you know, the Stadium Authority Board was created in the 2016 special session to oversee Allegiant Stadium and make sure that the state and local governments received the benefit of the law that was passed in 2016. That is the same concept that is currently in this bill. The Stadium Authority would provide oversight over the baseball stadium and make sure that the state and local governments, the citizens of Nevada, receive the benefit of what's intended by this bill. There are 3, and really maybe 4, primary agreements that the Stadium Authority enters into with what we call the developer partners, which is the A's and their partners in the development of the stadium events company, which is the A's and potentially a company that they bring along as either a partner or a subcontractor to operate the stadium, and then and that would be a lease, a lease with that organization. And then with the A's themselves is the non-relocation agreement that Mr. Aguero referred to, as well as the community benefit agreement that would be directly with the A's that you'll hear more about here shortly. On the next page, the Stadium Authority Board is currently made up of 9 members, 3 of whom are appointed by the governor, 3 of whom are appointed by the county commission. 1 is appointed by UNLV, and then those 7 members appoint 2 additional members to the Stadium Authority, taking into consideration currently the recommendations from the Raiders. On the next page, you see what is proposed as changes to that. That would include 2 additional appointments, one by the Speaker of the Assembly, the other by the Majority Leader of the Senate. And the other change in this process would be that the 2 ad hoc appointments, one would be taking into consideration the recommendation of the Raiders, the other would be taking into consideration the recommendation of the A's. The Stadium Authority has a number of different responsibilities, some of which are outlined on this page. We are a public body. We are subject to the open meeting law. We are subject to public records requests and all of the laws that go along with being a public entity. We own and oversee the stadium and the land that the stadium is built on and the land that is around and supports the stadium. We are responsible for those three documents that I referenced: the development agreement, the lease, and the non-relocation agreement, as well as the community benefit agreement. It will be an agreement with the A's. And there are a number of other documents that support these, but those are the primary agreements that the Stadium Authority Board is responsible for. We manage the waterfall money, and those are the buckets that Mr. Guerrero explained. When there is more tax revenue collected than is necessary to pay the bonds, there are prescribed ways to utilize those additional funds. The Stadium Authority does not have discretion to change those parameters. We do have, as is noted here, responsibility for approving a maintenance plan for the stadium, for approving a budget to make sure that that maintenance is actually done for the stadium. So we do have some discretion inside of those buckets of money. We do not have discretion to change where that money goes. And then we are also responsible for arbitrating any disagreements that may come up between UNLV and the Raiders. In terms of other project elements, I'll mention one thing first. The Aviators that play at the ballpark in Summerlin are the AAA minor league affiliate of the A's. They will not be required to move. They will continue to play in the ballpark. It provides really great synergy for the team. Their minor league team is right there with them. Also provides really a kind of a benefit to the community because you get to know players early, and as they move into the major leagues, you feel like you know them for a longer period of time. But the Aviators will be able to stay in Las Vegas moving forward. And Mr. Chairman, if it's okay with you, I'd like to ask Ms. King and Ms. Aker to join us here to talk about the community benefit agreement. Thank you for being here with us, both of you.
Thank you both, and we'll welcome our two other presenters to the table. Welcome to the Committee of the Whole. And when you are ready, please proceed.
Good morning. I'm Chair Yeager and members of the committee. I am Yolanda King, and I'm here to discuss with you my role in the community benefits agreement, and wanted to first express my thanks to all of you whom I've met with over the past few months to discuss really what your desires are, what you'd like to see in a community benefits plan. As I met with each of you, I did explain the purpose of a community benefits plan, what types of benefits that are included in community benefits plans that are across the country. So I shared those ideas with you, and then next was to gain an understanding from each of you with regard to what you would like to see as part of the benefits that would be provided to our community, to our state. Some of the things that I have heard from you included to make sure that there is a construction workforce diversity, meaning that in the construction work, as part of that project, that we make sure that we include minorities, female, veteran, and disabled individuals. In addition to that, we discussed the stadium operations and making sure that there's diversity that's included as part of the workforce in the operations of the stadium. Again, that would include diversity of minority, women, disabled individuals, as well as veterans. Subcontracting and vendor diversity was also mentioned by many of you, and how important that is to ensure that there is diversity within your nonprofits, your small business organizations, or your vendors. We discussed what also was important to you was having a livable wage. So ensuring that the employees that are working either in the construction or the operation side of the house are paid at least a livable wage, and that there are also benefits such as health care that are also provided. Additionally, infrastructure was also a big concern for many of the members of the legislature. There was quite a bit of discussion on making sure that there's infrastructure to mitigate the intended traffic concerns that may come because of the stadium. We've talked about making improvements to community fields throughout the state of Nevada, particularly probably in the underserved areas, the rural and the urban underserved areas, and then any other impacts that the stadium may bring. What do we do in terms of infrastructure to mitigate those concerns? The community engagement. There was quite a bit of discussion on community engagement to make sure that the A's are involved in the community and not just in the Southern Nevada community, but we talked about having their involvement throughout the state of Nevada. Team player participation, having ticket donations, participation in youth sports, as well as a very high priority of legislators was making sure that the team and the players participate as part of our educational programs throughout the state of Nevada. There was a discussion about including some form of art or having an art plan as part of the stadium authority. There was quite a bit of discussion on monetary commitment and what that looks like with the A's contributing some portion of some of the team's revenues that they receive back to the community. We talked about career development and scholarships and having internships. And also what was brought up on several occasions has to do with the accountability piece of it. There was discussion of having annual reporting of some sort that comes back not only to this body, but also to the Clark County Board of Commissioners, and having some sort of enforcement that would apply should the team not comply with the community benefits agreement. One thing I want to just kind of reiterate here is we're talking about the idea of the benefits that will be provided to the community. This would be in the form of a binding agreement. So yes, we've talked about putting a plan together, but ultimately what ends up happening is that the plans that are outlined in terms of what the team will provide ends up being in a binding agreement. And so I think that's important, and so that's also whereby, you know, you see the accountability, and should they not follow through with the binding agreement, that there's obviously legal actions that can take place as a result of not fulfilling the agreement. And so based on your feedback, what you do have in front of you is we have provided for you a term sheet of what the A's have minimally have stated that they will commit into the state of Nevada in terms of those community benefits. And next to me I have Ms. Aker, who will provide for you what some of the benefits that they currently are providing. A lot of what has been mentioned from the members of the legislature in terms of what you want to see in a community benefit agreement aligns exactly with what the A's are currently providing in the community. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Aker.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Aker. I'm the Vice President of Marketing, Communications, and Community for the Athletics. I have been spending the last year or so in the community in Nevada and on a listening tour, making sure I understand what the needs are of the local communities and how a baseball team can really kind of come in and make some incredible benefits to the community. And as Ms. King said, I have a number of the engagement that's laid out in the term sheet is part of also the work that we already do currently in Oakland and the East Bay. And I'm here to highlight some of that work right now for you. First and foremost, you know, the A's are committed to the following engagement if the team were to come to Nevada. We are committed to cash and in-kind support of $500,000 during the construction phase of the ballpark, and a minimum of $1.5 million to the community once the ballpark is operating. We are committed to complimentary tickets to community organizations and nonprofits, as well as a community suite for every game. We are committed to internships and scholarship programs for high school and college students throughout the state of Nevada. We also have a robust community engagement in the youth space, youth baseball and softball programming throughout the state, as well as education programs in literacy and STEM work. We will host awareness nights at the ballpark, and those are listed out, some of the ones that we currently do, and we will work with the community to find awareness nights that are important for us to also highlight. We'll have a nonprofit partner of the game. We currently have that where we highlight a nonprofit for every single game, and they get social media posts and in-game mentions and kind of awareness and tabling opportunities. Our players and our staff will also be out in the community volunteering and giving back, in addition to the cash contributions that we will make. I think that's it. Thank you.
And Yolanda King, for the record, a lot of the discussions that we've had today, we have extended and amended the current SB 1 to include at a very broad level some details of what the community benefits agreement will look like. So you will see that, and Mr. Aguero will go over, the fine points of what that looks like. But just wanted to reiterate that as part of that agreement, either through the term sheet or through what is noted in the amended SB 1, it will cover the development and the diversity of what it looks like for construction and operations, as well as, the workforce standards for small businesses and vendors and nonprofits. It does include a cash and an in-kind support of the community benefits. It also includes an additional $500,000 like during the construction phase, so there will be dollars dedicated, as part of the community benefits agreement prior to the opening of the stadium. The agreement is intended to be reviewed every 5 years. Many of you had discussed, or we discussed, that generally the term of an agreement aligns with the term of the bond, so it's a 30-year agreement typically. And so you will want to take a look at and review that agreement every 5 years, particularly because the needs of the community obviously can change in a matter of, a couple of years, 5 years, definitely over a 30-year period. So there will be that 5-year inclusion or review of the actual plan. The oversight committee that's responsible for the implementation as well as the compliance of the agreement, their meetings will be subject to open meeting law. There's a community suite that will be dedicated by the A's with the intent of purposes of fundraising. I've discussed the infrastructure investments, and I've also discussed internships, scholarship programs, and then lastly, the enhanced reporting. Please note that on the actual oversight committee, that language has been amended to include the appointments from the governor's office, from the Senate Majority Leader, as well as a Speaker of the Assembly. So they would receive 1 appointment each, and then 2 from the County Commission, as well as 2 from the Stadium Authority. So that would make up the oversight committee that would be responsible for ensuring implementation and compliance of the plan. So Chair, those are all my comments, and I would like to turn this back over to Mr. Hill and Mr. Aguero.
Thank you, Ms. King and Ms. Akers. Welcome back to the table, Mr. Aguero and Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Steve Hill. Obviously, the stadium would be built on the southeast corner of Tropicana and Las Vegas Boulevard. It's an important intersection in Las Vegas. It's on the most iconic street in the country. Traffic considerations are important and have been taken into consideration. There is certainly more work that will be done. I will start by pointing out, and I think Mr. Aguero mentioned this earlier, there is a high-impact project process that County Public Works, and really more than just Public Works, but led by Public Works, goes through for every major project that is built in Clark County. This project will qualify for that process. It's an amplified process to make sure that the considerations that need to be thought through are done very thoroughly. So Kimley Horn, the engineering company that is the traffic engineer in Las Vegas, has done a traffic study in this area. That work was important to get to this point, but the work then with the county, once this bill is actually passed and this project can move forward, will complete that exercise and make sure that all the topics that need to be considered are. This intersection will be will allow for the baseball stadium with the highest walk-in traffic anywhere in the United States. We believe that about a third of the attendees, really for any event, whether it's baseball or others, will be able to walk and will walk to attend events in that stadium. There's already quite a bit of work that is happening on Tropicana, particularly the work expanding the intersection at Tropicana and I-15. The northern phase of that project will be complete by the end of this year. The southern phase of that project will be complete, a year and a quarter after that, something like that, but certainly well in advance of the stadium being open. It's a really helpful added capacity that will take place there at I-15. On the east side of the stadium, near UNLV and Thomas and Mack and the entrance to the airport, there's another major project that is contemplated that is intended to start well prior to the stadium being open that will add additional capacity on Tropicana as well. The project and the site benefits from having Reno Road run around what is currently the Tropicana site, which is a 36-acre site, 9 of which will be the stadium. That road allows access to the site from the south, from the east, and from the north down Koval, and Koval turns into Reno as it crosses Tropicana. So that you can access that site off of Reno without having to go through the intersection of Tropicana and Las Vegas Boulevard. The only time you would actually have to cross the strip is if you were coming directly from the west on Tropicana. It's capable of being accessed without doing that from every other direction. The monorail currently stops at MGM, which is right across the street from where this project would be. As many of you probably know, there are park and rides for virtually every major event, every major sporting event in Las Vegas. We do that for Raiders games, we do it for Knights games. In partnership with RTC, we would do that here as well. And this, on that intersection, there's about 20,000 parking spaces just on the properties that directly are on the Tropicana Las Vegas Boulevard intersection in structured parking. Well more than would be needed for any event that would happen in a 32,000 seat stadium. And this stadium will be the first stadium built in the Loop era in Las Vegas. This is just a rendition of what is being worked on now. The design work is being done for this. This will allow underground access. It will connect ultimately to parking garages at Mandalay Bay. It will the Boring Company is purchasing, it's been approved by the Regents, land near the Thomas and Mack where they will construct a stadium and be able to connect UNLV students to Allegiant Stadium was the original thought, so that it would be easier for them to attend games at Allegiant Stadium, but it passes right by this site, and this site was intended to be included in that loop area, and certainly will be moving forward. Mr. Guerrero also talked about the process for putting together the numbers that are in this presentation regarding the number of events that will be held at the stadium, the attendance at those events, and then ultimately the taxes that are generated because of all of that activity. You mentioned that Legends put those numbers together. Legends put numbers together for the Allegiant Stadium project. And as he said, I'm not sure who I'm sure there's competition out there. We're just not aware. But Legends does just a vast majority of the work in this field. In this, their projection is for 3 additional sporting events and 5 concerts per year at this stadium. And while Legends is great, our staff at the LVCVA knows more about special events in Las Vegas than Legends does. That is an exceptionally conservative number. We will have more events in this stadium that are sporting events, concerts, other types of events, events that our trade show customers want to have. They have many of our trade show customers or corporate events that are in Las Vegas need places for the 30, 40, 50,000 people that they bring to Las Vegas for those events, to have keynote speakers, to have additional places to display. Those events will be at this stadium as well. When those events are ticketed, they are functionally, because of the makeup, because of different tax structure for baseball than there are for other types of events, particularly around LET, those additional events are worth about 3.5 baseball games in terms of tax generation. So to put it a different way, if we had just 8 more concerts or sporting events at the stadium, it would be equivalent to reducing baseball attendance down to about 50% of the capacity rather than 85% of the capacity. We think that is likely on the special event side. I will turn it over to Mr. Guerrero.
Chairman Yeager, members of the committee, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. I'm now going to jump us forward to slide 36 and talk a little bit about some of the stadium impacts. We're going to talk about impacts in terms of economic impacts, jobs, wages, and salaries, economic output. We're going to talk about fiscal impacts in terms of taxes that are collected. And we're also going to have, I guess we've already had a conversation, or you all have had a conversation already relative to some of the social impacts associated with the project. But much of what makes this project different than similarly situated baseball stadiums around the United States is the fact that Southern Nevada welcomes 40 million visitors every year. Those visitors get on a plane, they get in a car, they come to Las Vegas, and they spend money in our hotels, going to shows, eating in our restaurants, gambling in our casinos. We believe that about the total attendance at the stadium will be about 2.6 million people each year. Of those 2.6 million, about 30% will be folks from out of town. About 762,000 of the attendees at events at the stadium will not be residents of Southern Nevada. Among those, from an economic impact standpoint, we only consider incremental visitation. And that incremental visitation is someone who says, I would not have come to Las Vegas otherwise. I wouldn't have made that extra trip. I wouldn't have come for the first time to see it if it wasn't for the event, whether a concert, a baseball game, or other special event that's being held there. I would not have come otherwise. That number is just under 16% of the total visitation, or total attendance, at the stadium. I believe we were conservative relative to Allegiant Stadium. They've outperformed those numbers. I believe we're probably conservative here, but this is based on a number of things. Profiles of other baseball stadiums around the country where they have draws of folks coming in from 100 miles or more. 15,000 surveys being put in the field, including folks from the American League West and what their willingness was to travel. And then we have tremendous information relative to what Allegiant Stadium is doing today and what T-Mobile is doing today or what the MGM Grand Garden is doing today in terms of putting on a concert and what, for example, and what share of the folks that are in there. So again, we do believe that about 405,000 of those attendees each year will be incremental visitors. There are 3 types of stadium economic impacts that I'll talk to you about briefly today. The first is construction impacts. These are one-time impacts that come from the construction of the facility itself. The second are annual operational impacts that come from the operations of not only the Major League Baseball team, but also the stadium itself. And then the incremental visitation. Again, I'm not thinking about all visitation here. I'm only thinking about those incremental 405,000 incremental visitors. From a construction impact standpoint, what I'm showing here up on the slide is direct, indirect, and induced. Direct employees are those that get their paycheck from working on the construction. Indirect employees are those that work for suppliers when you buy concrete or steel or wood or anything else that goes into the project. And the third is induced. And that's when an employee of the project takes their paycheck back to their neighborhood and they spend it in a restaurant or a grocery store or a doctor's office. The folks that work in those facilities, at least some portion of their position is dependent upon that expenditure by that employee. We look at those one-time construction impacts, it's about 14,000 person years of employment. Important distinction. This is one person employed during 1 year during the construction. The estimated timeline for the construction is roughly 3 years. We've estimated this not based on $1.5 billion, but based on $1.2 billion, and an estimate that about 50% of the project will be split between labor and capital. The way we got to the employment numbers is simply by looking at the amount of labor on the project and dividing it by the average wage per employee that's in the construction industry, about $66,000 per employee per year. In reality, the average wage per employee is likely to be higher because this analysis was done before the project entered into an agreement with the Building and Trades Union, which is likely to put upward pressure probably in the $75,000 to $80,000 per employee range. In terms of total economic output, $2.1 billion is expected during the construction phase of the project. A little less than every $1 invested in the project leads to another dollar that's spent somewhere else throughout the community. In the center portion of the slide that you're looking at are the operational impacts, stadium and team. Right? We expect, and these include full-time and part-time employment, which is important here because many of these employees are covered by the culinary union because of the agreement that's put in place. As a matter of fact, the estimate is about 90% of the employees at the stadium will be covered by the collective bargaining agreement. From that perspective, if a person works 2,000 hours, that's great. If a person works 1,000 hours, they're also expected to work another 500 hours at the convention center or at other stadiums or somewhere else, getting them to a higher share overall. But in total, we expect about 8,000 total jobs, full-time and part-time, direct, indirect, and induced, resulting from the project. Wages and salaries total about $440 million, and economic output every year of the operation at about $1.3 billion. If we take those 405,000 incremental visitors that we talked about before, and we look at how much they spend when they're in our community, they're going to generate about $571 million a year on average during the 30-year operations of the facility that will be spent somewhere in our community, spent on rooms and food and beverage and everything else, transportation and the like. A total amount of wages and salaries about $326 million a year, and a combined economic impact of about $900 million annually, again, on average throughout the 30-year life of the project. If we look at it in terms of the fiscal impacts as opposed to the economic impacts, it's the same 3 major categories. It includes one-time construction impacts, about $39 million during the 3-year construction timeline. Operational impacts of about $17 million a year for sales tax, modified business tax, other taxes that are included there. Respecting the fact that property tax, the project is owned by the public, the property taxes are abated throughout the term. And then finally, the incremental visitation. We take that $571 million that's spent directly and the other dollars that flow through our economy, but this only focuses on the direct element associated with that. gaming tax, sales and use taxes, room taxes, and many other taxes, live entertainment taxes, are generated as a result of those expenditures and are estimated at about $36.5 million overall. Mr. Hill mentioned that the project generates about $3 in tax revenue for every $1 that is utilized for essentially the tax incentive toward the A's. You're seeing that here. A portion of those annual operations revenue is the principal and interest payment, and then that waterfall that we talked about, the coverage that we talked about. The incremental visitation, none of that inures to the benefit of the A's. That is the benefit of developing a project in a community that welcomes 40 million visitors every year. The incremental visitation leads to incremental tax revenue, which is demonstrated here. The taxes that are intended to be included, as we'll talk about potentially as we walk through the bill, are all included here. The model has only been done to include a handful of those: sales tax, payroll taxes, commerce taxes, and live entertainment taxes, because we have the ability to do that based on the structure of the financial model that exists today. Liquor taxes, local government business license fees, franchise fees on energy would all also inure to the benefit of the project, allowing it to have a greater diversity of revenues and ultimately providing security for bonds that would be issued by the county. With that, Chair Yeager, that's the completion or the culmination of our prepared remarks. If it would please the committee, I'd be happy to do a quick overview of the sections by the bill. If you prefer that we don't do that, I'm happy to do that as well, but whatever's appropriate for the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Aguero. I think at this point, in the interest of time, we will go to questions instead, and members do have a copy of the mock-up, so if there are specific questions about specific sections of that mock-up, I would ask you to refer to that. Before I open it up for questions, though, I did want to note one thing I forgot to say in my opening remarks. The email address that was listed on the agenda as one where folks could send comments, I did get some information yesterday that folks were receiving an automatic reply from that email indicating the mailbox was not being monitored. That was a mistake, so that has been turned off, and I can assure you that every email that's been sent there, starting yesterday and beyond, has been received and will be made part of the record. So I wanted to make that clear for anyone who still has some confusion about that. So we are going to start with questions from the committee. And committee members, if you can just light up your speak button on the screen, and I see lots of them lighting up right now. I would ask you all to be patient as we work our way through. We're going to have about 25 minutes for questions before we break and come back. So let's see who's going to be our lucky first person to ask a question. Why don't we go to Assemblyman Watts?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much for the presentation. There's a lot to consider, and appreciate some of the work that's been done with regards to the amendments. I guess one of the things that I've talked about before, and that I guess I'll focus on with my first question, is around the community benefits agreement, and I know that others may need to come down to answer questions related to that. I appreciate that there's been a little bit more laid out in this. I guess the big picture question I have is that I'm hoping to understand how this works, because now in statute we have a role for the Stadium Authority Board, a role for the Community Oversight Committee, and then there's also going to be a director position. And so I think the big picture question I have is, how do all of those play in? And you've got a 5-year statutory review by the board, but you're supposed to have this ongoing oversight by the director and the community advisory board. So just understanding better the roles and responsibilities of each of those entities, and how collectively that ensures that that this is being carried out, and that there's actually community voice involved in that process, and so that's kind of the main question. And then I guess specifically, what within that, what authority or what kind of teeth does that community oversight board have? It looks like ultimately they don't have any real discretion in designating where funds are going, as long as they're kind of within some of the various categories that are listed in the agreement. So I'm just really trying to understand what the agency that diverse group of people would have in actually helping guide and deploy the benefits of the agreement.
Assemblyman Watts, Yolanda King for the record. So the Stadium Authority is the party to the agreement. So ultimately, the binding agreement lies between the team and the Stadium Authority. The Oversight Committee would include exactly what you just mentioned, and one of the reasons why we did not want to completely outline what the agreement would look like is the Oversight Committee would include gathering information from the public, because we've not gone through that process yet, and trying to understand, what are some of the feedbacks, or what can be some of the feedback from the public. So I would envision this being that there is input that's provided by the public with regard to benefits to the community that the public sees would be beneficial to us. That Oversight Committee gathers that information, and then you still have the process of going through and negotiating the agreement. So based on the public input, based upon these minimum commitments that are provided to you by the team, the Stadium Authority would then develop a formal agreement that would include that input from the community as well as the legislators, and put that into a formal agreement. The next step beyond that is, once you have an agreement in place, the Oversight Committee would then be responsible, obviously under the direction of the Stadium Authority, because that is who the agreement is with. They would have the responsibility of ensuring that the components of that agreement, that they're being adhered to, they're being complied to from the team, and there would be reporting from the Oversight Committee back to the Stadium Authority with regard to the implementation and the compliance of that agreement.
Thank you for that, and not going to ask a follow-up question. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the work that has gone into this. I do still feel that some of the things that have come across in some of our discussions are not fully reflected, but I'll follow up with that offline. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assemblyman Watts. We'll go next to Assemblyman Hafen.
Thank you, I guess, Mr. Chair is what we're calling you today. And I want to thank you guys for being here and giving the presentation today. And so my question is, I live in Knight County, and we have seen a couple of tax abatements, tax credits that have been on the books that have actually ended up hurting our community and been a loss to our state. For one, the film tax credit, we've given out $22 million roughly in film tax credits, but we've only returned $6 million for a roughly $18 million loss to the state. The other one is the solar tax abatements. Currently, we are seeing companies come in, closing our public lands, impacting our economic development, especially when the off-road community, so they could sell power to California. And we're losing that tax revenue that the counties could be receiving. And so my question to you guys is that what you're claiming in the presentation is that this is going to be a net positive to the state as a whole. But why aren't we looking at some of these others, tax credits, tax abatements, that have actually cost the state and cost the local communities, to shift the burden from what I'll call, personal opinion, losers to what you guys are claiming to be winners? And so that's my question to you is, if this is going to be positive, why not get rid of the negative and just shift everything over so we don't have another problem on our hands in the future? Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Assemblyman Steve Hill. We frankly don't have standing to answer that question, and we do know that this is going to be a good deal for the entire state. That return on investment will inure to the general fund here, will be able to be spent throughout the state. We know an awful lot about the tourism, hospitality, sports, and entertainment industry, and feel very comfortable saying this is an excellent deal for the state of Nevada.
Assemblyman DeLong.
Thank you, Chair, and appreciate the presentation. I wanted to touch on your financial model. That's, looking at that, I think focusing specifically on slide 38. What sort of financial stress tests have you done in your model, and specifically focusing on attendance? Because I think that's the big question we all have. The A's have not been performing well. Their attendance is low in Oakland. And so have you done a stress test on your model looking at, let's say, 25 or 50% less attendance from the games, not necessarily focusing on the other events? Thank you.
Assemblyman DeLong, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. The answer to your question is yes. We've done those stress tests. The analysis that I mentioned early on that was done by PFM looked at the sort of 10, 20, 25%, I forget exactly the number, stress test in terms of reduction. We ran a stress test at everything from 95% revenue all the way down to 50% revenue, with and without the increase in other events at the facility, because we also wanted to run the stress test since, as Mr. Hill said, the LVCVA sort of feels like we're underestimating the number of non-baseball events that would be there. There's obviously, it's not always linear, as you might imagine, right? We bring in an event that's a concert, for example. It generates live entertainment tax, where a baseball game would not. For example. In addition to that, you've got other things that can sort of move that needle. At the end of the day, we dropped it all the way down to 60% and even below that, and we're still above the 1-to-1 coverage number. Interestingly enough, if we look at it differently in terms of replacing some of the less activity that happens while we have more, it actually ends up benefiting us significantly, because the value from the visitor standpoint is greater from a tax perspective than the value of a resident going to a game, because they stay in a hotel room and all of those type of things. And so what we found is wherever there's that trade-off that occurs, we can actually take that number down pretty far and still be generally okay from a bond perspective. Now, obviously no one wants that to happen, but yeah, we stress tested it all the way down until it broke. Yes, sir.
We're going to go next to Assemblywoman Cohen, who I believe is joining us on Zoom. So please go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. So when I met with Ms. King, and I do appreciate it, Ms. King was the only person to meet with me about this project, except for someone from Labor who dropped off a couple letters, or 4 letters to be exact. But we talked about the community benefits plan, and the one thing that I stressed that I thought was important was a compliance monitor, an independent compliance monitor. So as I've looked through the amendment, I see that there's a compliance director, but it looks to me like they're beholden to the stadium authority. What happened to the possibility of getting an independence compliance monitor? And yeah, where are we with that? I'd like to see, again, someone who is independent and not beholden to the A's or the, frankly, to the stadium authority. I think that's very important, especially since there is so much work that needs to be done on this plan. Can you please just address that, the independence right now?
Assemblywoman Cohen, Yolanda King for the record. The compliance director that you do see in the term sheet, that is the compliance monitor that you requested. We can probably put some language around that person being independent, so that is missing, but the compliance monitor is the director that was intended to do exactly what you just explained.
Okay, thank you. Yes, yeah, I don't care about their title, but yeah, I do think it's really important. So I think I'd ask for two things, that they are paid for by the A's, but that they are independent. So I do want that to be very clear that this person needs to be independent and not beholden to anyone except for the community. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Cohen. We'll go next to Assemblywoman LaRue Hatch.
Thank you, Chair. So my question is on the economics of this deal. We are being in the nation, addressing summer school, addressing so many other things that we were told just a few days ago are not affordable. And so I want to make sure that we are actually going to get a positive return on our investment. To that end, I've done a lot of research, as have many of my colleagues out to economists. The Nevada Independent had a great article on this. There was a quote from J.C. Bradbury, who's an economist, who says, "Anyone who is telling you that there's an economic benefit to the stadium deal is lying. I've studied this deal to death. There's universal agreement. People will always say, but this one is different. Every single stadium deal I've ever looked at, people are saying this one is different, and they are always the same." There's other quotes from other economists. We know that 83% say that this is a negative investment. We know that 14% say that its positives don't really outweigh the negatives, so 3% say it's a good idea. And so my question is, if you're going against 97% of economists, what your qualifications are to dismiss 97% of economists. And so I just want to know who at your table has a PhD in economics and what your credentials are to allow you to dismiss them.
Sure. For the record, I'm assuming that's directed toward me. Assemblywoman, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. No one sitting up here has a PhD in economics. I've spent my career studying this economy and this industry, and I'm more than happy to evaluate any other analyses that are there. I've heard a lot about what you said. Obviously, there's been a lot of chatter that's out there. I'm not aware of any of those folks that have done an analysis here in the state of Nevada, much less in Southern Nevada. And if they are, they're welcome to give me a call and we can have a conversation about our assumptions versus their assumptions as it relates. Not surprising to get all of this because I understand where this comes from and I want to be clear about this. Those analysts that look at stadiums and arenas around the United States are largely correct. And I want to be very clear about that. They are largely correct. If you build a stadium or an arena in a location that does not benefit from visitation the way ours would, if we took out the 40 million visitors that come a year and the assumptions of how many of them are going to come because of this facility, it would have a negative fiscal and economic impact. Okay, so let me be clear about that. Beyond that, we got a lot of the same criticism from all of the same people around Allegiant Stadium. And so I pulled just a few of the articles that were written in 2016. October 2016, in the Reno Gazette-Journal, quoted Roger Knoll, who's a Stanford economist, well-respected throughout, and he suggested the proponents are projecting nearly 33% tourist attendance when Knoll said that other teams never break single digits. He pointed to the Angel Stadium in Anaheim, California, which is close to Disneyland, yet still doesn't break double digits in terms of tourism attendance. The idea that the thing is going to pay for itself is because of a huge inflow of tourists is crazy. He was also skeptical of how many events the stadium would actually host outside of 16 Raiders and Rebels games. There's not a stadium in the country that has more than 4 or 5 that draws those kinds of people, Knoll said. Exactly what it is about the Las Vegas Stadium, unlike any other NFL stadiums, that's going to cause it to be used extensively for events that don't occur elsewhere. I would suggest that Allegiant Stadium, having done more than 40 events, I think over 3 million folks that are there, better than doubling the estimates in terms of the visitors that were there, suggests that the analysis that was done there was correct. Deadspin, May 2023. Another commentary relative to the whole thing. In order for this deal to be direct transfer of in order for this direct deal not to be, a direct transfer of $750 million to Mark Davis, the numbers need to bear it out. The problem is they won't. So the issue becomes, how badly do the numbers miss their targets? The visibility of projects hinges on whether these stadium events actually draw tourists, and the notion that tourism will be a big part of it is just silly. It was something to convince local politicians that it was good for them. Every single thing that they made an assumption on has no prior evidence anywhere elsewhere, and question the argument that the new stadium would draw considerably more tourists to the desert. Why would they believe 500,000 who would never visit Las Vegas would suddenly show up because there was a football stadium? Again, more than doubling the estimates for those. Finally, the Las Vegas Sun on October 5th. In the end, if all of these wildly optimistic things happen, it is certainly possible that the stadium makes sense. But you have to have an unbelievable, ridiculous number of things to go right in order to do it. Assemblywoman, I've heard the criticism. I've seen it. I believe that when you look at what our state and our community has the ability to do, it sets us apart. And whether I'm in the minority of the 14% or the minority of the 3%, or you'd like to challenge my credentials or anyone else's to get it done, I will stand behind the analysis that's been done. And I'll stand behind the fact that the folks that have reviewed it are the foremost experts in the United States on visitor economics, or economics as they relate to stadiums: Goldman Sachs, Hobsong and Associates, PFM, and our firm. So I'm comfortable with it.
Assemblywoman Steve Hill, I will just add, to put a point on that, they were wrong when they made those comments 7 years ago. That stadium has performed, from a visitation standpoint, about 180% of what was projected at the time. So the benefits that we projected 7 years ago, we knew were enough to make that deal make sense. It has performed 80% better than that.
Thank you for that. So just to confirm, though, much like every other community, you're telling us that our community is different.
Assemblywoman, for the record, Jeremy Aguero, yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. We'll have time for, I think, a couple more questions before we break. We'll go next to Assemblywoman Kasama.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you again for the presentation. I'm looking at the project funding structure is my question regarding this, and I see that we had the $180 million from the state, and it's gone from $90 million refundable to $120 million, so that is great. So now as I review that, I just wanted to confirm what we have now is basically a $60 million exposure for the state. Would that be correct?
Assemblywoman, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. I think the easy answer to your question is yes. There's also the credit enhancement that backstops the bonds, and so that obviously provides some exposure. And the only other thing that I would suggest to you is you've also heard the A's come up here today and say that they're willing to make a contribution of $500,000 a year during construction, and somewhere between 1.5 million and however much 1% of ticket sales to games are. I'd put that estimate at closer to 2 million times 30 years is another $60 million. So I don't know whether you net that off or whether you don't, but to your point, you're pretty close.
And then along with the funding structure here, from the Clark County, the Sports and Entertainment Improvement District, that's $200 million there, is that correct?
Assemblywoman, for the
Or up
record,
to.
Jeremy Aguero, I don't think it's going to be quite $200 million from the Sports and Entertainment District. It could be that high, but right now it's estimated about $95 million on its own and about $125 million with the state backstop, allowing us to borrow more because the state is essentially giving us some more buying power with the dollars that are estimated for the district.
Mm-hmm. And are those bonds expected to be issued in total immediately or in stages?
Yeah. Assemblywoman, for the record, Jeremy Aguero, great question. They'll be issued at a single point in time is the way that it's structured in the bill.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Assemblywoman Backus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question pertains to Section 36, as to the makeup of the Stadium Authority, specifically as you, and it kind of parallels just kind of what you were talking about as more of the state's backstop here, especially in light of Section 30 provisions that were added in what I guess is Amendment 1 mock-up. I don't think we have Amendment 2 before us, so we're working off that one with respect to the treasurer's oversight. And I was curious why it is now that in Section 36, we are now removing the state treasurer from the Stadium Authority, but going ahead to leave the county treasurer, especially in light of the state being the backstop and all of the other mandates set forth in Section 30 that will involve our state treasurer.
Assemblywoman, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. Treasurer is critically important to this process. The credit enhancement, everything that's there, the treasurer makes important determinations throughout the bill relative to the sufficiency of funds. My understanding of why that amendment was requested was because in the section that you're mentioning, you'll also notice that it creates responsibility for the interim finance committee to provide affirmation, if you will, that there is a shortfall that needs to be made up from the line of credit. And so that particular appointment was unnecessary.
Assemblywoman Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I do appreciate the painstaking scenarios you went through to explain to us. My question actually has to do with Clark County. And the question is, what happens if this is a default? What happens to the employees of Clark County, since I have a great number of them that lives in my district? You know, I want to make sure that there is a backstop. I want to make sure that those employees are not laid off or furloughed. So I want to know whether or not you had that conversation with Clark County when you went over all of this.
Assemblywoman Steve Hill. Just to start with, to put it in the financial aspects of this in perspective, well, $120 million of bonding is a lot of money. The payment each year when we start is in the $9 million a year range. Over the course of 30 years, that approximately doubles, I think. You know, they have more than a $2 billion general fund. This is kind of a drop of the general fund that they are committing. And that $9 million, the state is taking the responsibility for half of that. That would be $4.5 million for the county and $4.5 million for the state in the event that no money in that district is collected at all. So this does not put other programs or employment at jeopardy.
Assemblyman Hibbets.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all the presenters. My question is, who owns or controls the sale or lease of naming rights for the stadium, and where does that money go?
Assemblyman Hibbins, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. The naming rights are part of the contractually obligated income that inures to the benefit of the stadium itself. So in this particular circumstance, the A's would be the one that benefits from it.
Thank you.
Assemblywoman Brown May.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. I'm going to pivot, if you don't mind, for just one quick second. I'd like to hear from the A's relative to what their statement was, and I just would like a little bit of clarity around the listening tour. That was new information that I'd not heard prior to today, despite all the hearings that we've been watching. And I believe you stated you've been on a listening tour for the last year. So would you talk through a little bit of the data? What did you find? Where is that? What are the community members, and what are the things they brought up? Do you have the data to support it?
So I've been meeting with a number of community members and nonprofits throughout Nevada. Many of those came to recommendation through other individuals and people that we have worked with. And really what I try to do is just understand what their work is, what their mission is, what they focus on, how they work with corporate partners, how they work with the other professional teams. So it was really more of an introductory type of meeting so I could really think about how we, if we come to Nevada, will do our community work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm curious to know if you have some of that data that you could share with us. I know that we are all interested in hearing that as well, as many of our constituents have weighed in on sort of what does this look like for us in our communities, and I think that would be helpful if we could see some of that data.
I apologize. I don't know if I understand your question because I believe, unless I'm mistaken, the data has been built into this community benefits agreement that Ms. King has been leading up that we've been supporting.
Okay, thank you. So then for clarification, you're talking about Ms. King's listening sessions relative to us in the development of the community benefits agreement, or did you do a separate listening session? And I don't really want to get into the meat of it. I'm not trying to beat you up. I'm just trying to really understand who are the community organizations that weighed in. Did you do roundtables in specific communities? Did you look at underrepresented communities? Did you look at minority communities? Did you look at the Native American tribes that we have? I mean, like, who weighed in to help you develop that beyond the community benefits agreement that we have in front of us that we've weighed in on? That's really what I'm looking for.
Sure. So we met with a number of organizations the types of organizations that we currently work with. So I met with food insecurity, so 3 Square. I met with us, and forgive me because I don't have the list in front of me, Spread, thank you, Spread the Word, to talk about their book literacy program, and we went to their warehouse to understand kind of how they're working in schools. We met with representatives from Ty's Place. I met with the Public Education Foundation to talk about the education things that we do there. I met with a number of Little League leaders because, again, our work is also going to include youth baseball and softball. I would like to say that the work is not done. Over the next year, additionally, if this does pass and move forward, we will be back in the community really doing the robust work. This was just the beginning, but what I tried to do was meet with a number of organizations across the different spectrums of the work that we already do: literacy, food insecurity, homelessness initiatives, and things like that.
Thank you. I sincerely appreciate the detail, and I appreciate that you're continuing to work in the community benefits agreement and building those relationships. I think that's going to be essential as we go forward. As my colleague stated earlier, I believe question 1 was really around the community benefits agreement and building that relationship. It was a conversation I had with the owner of the A's a week ago relative to how do you show up and really participate in our community. I think we have an exceptional track record relative to that. I'd like to see that continue as we go forward, and I believe that we're not really there yet on the community benefits agreement, and so for me, that's where I'd like us to continue to work.
Yes, and I want to make sure there's an understanding that the work will not just be the community benefits. As an organization, we have a 501c3. We will do more above and beyond kind of what is required as part of the stadium and ballpark. It's the work that we will do initially as an organization, the core values that we believe in.
Thank you. And Ms. Aker, I know it's weird because I'm behind you, but if I could ask you and Ms. King, if you have the ability to maybe put together a list of the organizations you met with. I know we put you on the spot here, but I think that would be helpful for members. And then if members have suggestions going forward for other organizations that can be included, I think that would make sense to be able to do that. Obviously, I know you don't have that right now, but if it's something you could get to the committee of the whole, would really appreciate it.
Yes, I'll work on that during the break. And I apologize, I did not say my name every time, but hopefully for the record, Catherine Aker, the A's.
That's okay. That's really on me. I'm supposed to remind you, so I was intrigued by the answer as well. Committee, we are going to go into recess because we have hit 12:47 p.m. It is our goal to be back here at 1:30. I know this is the legislature. I know that's probably optimistic, but if we could try our best to grab a quick bite to eat, come back refreshed, and we will get to the rest of the questions. So we'll be back around 1:30, and until then, we are in recess.